Thanks, thanks, Leo. There are at least two broad reasons why the public is elusive in today's education policy debates. The first has to do with what I'd say is a fairly undeveloped way we tend to think and talk about the notion of public in public education. And the second has to do with real institutional changes and political changes in the landscape that are making it in some ways more challenging to define and act on public goals. I'm going to use the first part of my presentation to address the first of these, laying out a way to think about various dimensions along which education may be more or less public. And then I'll use the second part to go into greater detail on one aspect having to do with democratic accountability and laying out what I call and what Leo referenced as the end of exceptionalism in American education and how that challenges the undertaking for advocates of a strong public education system. I see at least 5 dimensions in which it makes sense to think about public versus private nature of education. The first has to do with delivery. Is education provided by teachers who are governmental employees? For years, that was a pretty reliable indicator for distinguishing public education from private education in the US, but things have become more complicated, especially with the introduction of vouchers and charter schools into the mix. The second dimension has to do with financing. The hugely influential conservative economist Milton Friedman really pushed on distinguishing the difference between public employees as deliverers of education and public financing. He conceded that because of spillover effects of education, because of the potential of free riders who would try to take advantage of public education but wouldn't want to pay for it fully, that markets in and of themselves might underfund investment in public education. But he argued you could satisfy this while retaining private delivery of education through voucher kinds of systems where the funding could ensure that the public interest in an adequately funded education system was met, but the market and competition among providers, he argued, would force innovation and responsiveness to consumers. So along a financing dimension, a system of education can be seen as more or less public depending on what proportion of the investment is shouldered by the public. Third dimension involves regulation. Unregulated voucher systems might not meet such public goals as equity, as access and high performance for all, but at least in principle, these can be protected by a robust regulatory system. So charter schools can be seen in some ways as a response to this, an effort to pull that off. Charter systems that build in provisions for public lotteries to ensure, in principle, equal access to the schools, that prohibit tuition add-ons so that the public funding is sufficient and parents don't have to pay more to get into schools, that have provisions for closing non-performing schools, could be seen as more public than a pure voucher system because they operate within a regulatory system established to protect public values that, in a way that unrestrained markets would not or might not. Fourth dimension has to do with values, in particular the extent to which the system is oriented towards private goals, such as giving my kids the skills they need in order to do better in an economic competitive market versus collective ones, such as having to do with ensuring national economic competitiveness in a global system or the creation of a new generation of citizens with skills and values that can best sustain democracy. There's some who argue that this in itself is sufficient, that if schools produce good entrepreneurs, workers, and citizens, they can be considered public schools, even if they're privately delivered, privately funded, and relatively unregulated. And finally, there's a dimension of democratic accountability. the extent to which key decisions about education, including decisions about delivery, finance, and regulation, are made within public institutions designed so citizens have an effective voice in setting the agenda and holding public officials responsible if they fail to deliver the goods. Now, I think all of these are important, and that the notion of public in education has become elusive precisely because the 5 dimensions have become unhitched from one another in the US. So we can think about and even see systems that vary in the mixture of public and private along these dimensions. So I ask you to picture for a moment the, sort of these audio mixing consoles or soundboards that technicians use to adjust how much bass or how much treble or whether the background musicians' voices come through louder or not. And picture 5 sliding dials to control these 5 dimensions that I mentioned. Movements from public to private along these 5 dimensions may be complementary. In other words, they may move in the same direction, so that movement may all be in the direction from a more public delivery, public financing, et cetera, to the private side. And when that happens, I would refer to that as systemic privatization, a general movement away from a strong, vibrant, funded public education towards a more market-oriented one. But at least in prospect, shifts may be compensatory, so that a system might move somewhat towards private delivery, for example, but at the same time increase regulation. So when shifts along the private end, towards the private end of the spectrum on one dimension are accompanied by counterbalancing shifts towards the public end on one or more of the other dimensions, I refer to that as pragmatic privatization rather than systemic privatization. It does not necessarily imply an overall reduction in the role of public institutions in overseeing the system. And in fact, it at least has the potential to make it more flexible, dynamic, and resilient. And I'd argue that a lot of the toughest arguments now, including maybe some we'd engage in today, are about whether shifts automatically and necessarily create complementary shifts. Shifts in one dimension automatically bring the other dimensions along. Some who oppose the adoption of any market-like reform argue that even a small step in that direction necessarily leads towards a slippery slope leading to weakened public institutions. And on the other side, conversely, proponents of market systems often argue that any step in the direction of increasingly binding regulations, say on charter schools, necessarily will lead back to re-bureaucratization, homogeneous school systems, overly politicized education. Now, I consider the last dimension, democratic accountability, to be the one that I hold most sacrosanct because it represents the control center, the place where decisions are made that affect the others, where adjustments to changing conditions and changing values and shifts in the composition of the electorate can manifest themselves through negotiation and political competition to decide the agenda and to decide the kinds of systems we want to have. So in the rest of my time, I want to discuss changes that I believe are underway in the arena of democratic accountability. In the end of exceptionalism in American education, I suggest that a lot of the current dynamism, some would say turmoil in education policy, stems from change along some slow-moving institutional fault lines. 2 of these are familiar, and I won't talk about them. One has to do with the growing role of private providers, and the other, the growing centralization within the government system towards stronger state and national role. The third is what I call end of exceptionalism. And when I refer to that, I don't mean it as it's often used to mean U.S. American exceptionalism, U.S. versus other countries. What I mean, rather, is that the American education system has been different from those in other countries in the way we buffer it often into institutions that have a school-specific arena, school boards, boards of education, departments of education at the state and national level. I heard a ring. Does that mean I've got to be content? Okay.
That's just my iPad as a mind.
Oh, okay. I started to get nervous because I don't know if there's a hook here that's going to be action. So decisions about public schooling for many decades were insulated within local cocoons in which some actors, school boards, superintendents, teachers, and parents dominated. And these groups haven't gone away and these institutions haven't gone away. But as a result of broad governance changes, they've been joined and frequently overshadowed recently by new venues and new sets of actors who are previously more sporadic visitors to education issues. Mayoral control is the most visible and talked about form of this shift from education-specific institutions to general purpose governance. People here in DC or in New York and people watching know that in the last couple of decades, there have been moves from elected school boards to mayorally appointed school boards in a number of large cities, still by far the exception in the US, but increasingly prominent. But there's been a parallel and less noticed change in the power of governors that's similar. So in 2010, for example, the governors of 12 states had the authority to appoint the chief school officer, 3 times as many as did so in 1967. And in 2010, governors had the power to appoint all members of the State Board of Education in 31 states. In 1949, governors had the authority to do that in only 12. Similarly, you can argue at the national level, the role of the president and Congress have become more prominent. So one indicator in their State of the Union speeches, the 3 presidents who were first elected after A Nation at Risk came out in 1983, gave more than 2.5 times as much attention to education than did the 7 that preceded them. Now, why does this matter and what does it have to do with the topic today? My wife, Robin, is totally befuddled by team sports, and so I always hesitate before I use a sports metaphor, but I can't help myself sometimes. So I think of this in terms of rules of the game in sports. So consider basketball where the nets are 10 feet high and the court's 50 feet wide. What would happen if you raised the basket to 12 feet and widened the court to 70 feet? The patterns and the rhythms of the game to a casual observer, like Robin, would look pretty much the same. She would say, oh, it's still a bunch of guys running up and down in shorts. But those who know the game would recognize the changes in play calling and playmaking. Many of the skill sets would be the same, but some would become less consequential and others more so. So a 7-footer who can't really jump and who can dunk the ball in a 10-foot basket would have less impact on the game if the baskets were 12 feet tall. And smaller players who can shoot or pass and are more, have greater stamina would have more advantages on this wider court than on the current 50-foot court. In politics and governance, similarly, particular venues, institutional niches, Congress as opposed to the White House, states as opposed to local districts, mayors' offices as opposed to elected school boards. They serve as educational decision-making venues with their own rules of the game, rules that provide certain traditions, that norms of access, criteria for making decision-making that differ. And so when those institutional rules of the game change, the access of different kinds of groups and the kinds of ideas and arguments that hold sway can vary as well. It makes sense, in other words, to say that these issues of institutional agendas change the mix of groups and ideas that make up the activated and relevant public when it comes to democratic decision-making about the kinds of schools and educational systems we want to have. So, what are the implications for policy now and in the future? And I'll try to keep this short. First of all, let me say, my argument isn't that school-specific institutions are going away or teachers' unions and parent groups are going to be swamped by everything that's going on. It's an issue of relative impact and relative influence. I think there are some real risks and there are some benefits, and I'll just briefly mention some and stop. A big risk is that investment in public education will not fare as well in the broader arena of general purpose politics, where these education advocates and ideas have to compete on a more head-to-head basis with a range of other demands on governmental attention, governmental resources, as well as arguments for the alternative strategy of cutting spending and cutting taxes and relying on markets to achieve public goals. I think we can expect a diminished voice for teachers and parents, a less protected role for people who have genuine knowledge and expertise about education, about instruction and pedagogy. The effective electorate whose commitment to investing in education will be more diffuse and abstract than that of parents who are thinking about these issues because they affect their own kids right now. And not coincidentally, the language of privatization and accountability that have been long common in other areas of domestic policy, contracting out in a range of areas of social reform, will, as they have, become more common in high-level education reform debates. But I do think that there are some potential benefits to operating in these general purpose arenas as well as in these school-specific arenas. One potentially positive outcome of the increasing importance of education executives and all-purpose governments could be the erosion of the bureaucratic and political barriers that have pitted proponents of school reform against those who adopt a broader vision of education and seek to integrate education policy with other social policy efforts to address concentrated poverty, for example, income inequality, housing, and public health. I think a lot depends on politics. I don't think this stuff is predestined, including how education activists and education professionals respond. As a necessity, and at the least, education advocates, I think, will need to find more and better ways to work in multi-issue coalitions in order to compete in these general purpose arenas. And in order to do so, they'll need to reframe their arguments to win recruits and not just mobilize their natural base. So in conclusion, the landscape of educational politics and education policy making will be more rather than less complex, more open to change, but also more unpredictable in some ways. And whether this landscape produces better education and a healthier set of public institutions to oversee it won't be determined by the institutional changes, but by how we play the game within this new set of rules.